China was being muscular in the South China Sea, so hence the Indo-Pacific. And it, it was clear that the big rival for the United States in the years to come would not be Russia, but China. Although the antipathy towards Russia remained at a fairly high level. So this was the second trend. The third trend was US-China conflict or US-China, um, um, a confrontation. And President Trump, though packaged it in trade terms, in terms of tariffs and the trade war, it was actually much deeper than that. It actually went into, there was a countrywide change in consensus on China. Earlier, there had been a feeling that if we are good to China, China will start behaving just like any other country, and we'll all be happy together. And there was a lot of investment, there was a lot of tourism, there was a lot of, but that sort of changed over the last 3 years or so. That changed. It changed because there was a feeling that China has been taking us for a ride. China is robbing us of technologies. China is taking undue advantage of our generosity in different ways. And there was so while there was on the surface, it looked like a trade war, this was much more. So this is the third trend. And the fourth, I would say, which is a spin-off from the first, is an anti-globalization feeling. Now, this has been happening all over the world in many ways, but very, very pronounced in the United States. This not global, but local, So this protectionist, nativist kind of thinking was very, very pronounced in the US, and that was one of the factors in Trump's election in the first place. You saw it in some ways in Brexit. You saw it in other countries, in Brazil and some European countries. So there's this anti-globalization trend. Along with it comes the weakening of multilateral institutions. The UN Security Council reduced to nothing virtually because they can't ever agree on anything significant. The WTO being questioned hugely. And of course, now what has happened to WHO in the pandemic. So these were certain trends. Now, what happens to us after this pandemic passes, if and when it passes? I think that is essentially the first question. Now, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that it will upset everything. But I think more than it will upset everything, I think it has upset everything to the extent that it can already. Economies are in disarray. Countries are worried about how many people will die or live, rather than worry about minor trade issues or market access issues. The likelihood is that when this dust settles, the trends that I have outlined will probably get accelerated and accentuated, rather than a complete toss-up of the international chessboard. What you'll see is that the COVID will probably impact all these trends in some ways. For instance, in the US, if you had this look inwards, it's going to be more pronounced now. Their economy has contracted more than ever since the Great Depression. The unemployment rate, there was rejoicing the other day because the unemployment rate came down from 15% to 13%. And actually, Vice President Pence was on television, and the stock exchange was celebrating because it came from 15 to 13, but 13 is very high. So they are going to not be, the economy is not one that is going to open up and, bring in foreigners and let jobs go out. That sort of a thing, I think we are not going to see for a long time. The protectionist tendencies that President Trump has started, whether or not he comes back in November, may only change in degree. But I think they're pretty much set to carry on. Why? Also because there is a great feeling the world over, and more so in the United States, that the richest country in the world, the most developed country in the world, and you have 100,000 and more deaths. So there is something wrong here. And what is wrong, everybody is feeling, is that they have let the supply chains be extended too much. Everything is being made in China, or the raw materials have to come from there, or half the work has to be done there. I remember years ago, 20 years ago, we used to be shocked. We used to go and buy sports equipment or tennis shoes or tennis rackets in the United States, only to fly back to India and find that they were made in China when you actually read the fine print. But everything had an American name, but everything was made in China. So this extension of supply chains to a country with which you have a confrontation is something which people are going to look at. And whether or not they, I think President Trump uses the word reshore or onshore, or whether or not they do it all into the United States, they'll certainly want to do it in more friendly countries, in a regionally closer. So shortening of supply chains will happen. So this trend will clearly carry on. China's rise is a trend which I think at the moment is in a balance, because China is already trying to be very aggressive uh, in terms of firstly projecting that we handled Corona very quickly and very well. And secondly, being very aggressive about anybody who's saying that China was responsible for it. So they are toughening their stand around the world, and we are seeing it in our country. Uh, they're toughening it on the Taiwan issue, they're toughening it here, they're toughening it in the South China Sea. So this is part of the overall of aggression of China. So whether or not, and their advantage is that probably that their economy, being the way it is run, has probably got off on its feet more than other economies have, and probably they have a head start already. What they have lost is a trust element. So people are beginning to say that I will not buy Chinese stuff, or I will, I can't trust the Chinese to do this for me. So, somewhere this is going to be balanced off. So the trend of China rising may slow down, at least in the short or medium term. But what will not slow down is the US China confrontation. So the US China confrontation, I think, is only going to get sharper. So where you talked in terms of tariffs and all, now it will become a wider thing. It has already been, when President Trump started calling it the China virus, I think that was a big sign that, and this may get sharpened as we go into elections in November. So beyond the rhetoric also, I think the rivalry between US and China, the rivalry in the South China Sea, the rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, uh, will I think certainly be accentuated in the years to come. And the trend of multilateral institutions weakening will also be accentuated, because one, the Chinese are being very aggressive in increasing the influence in these institutions, whether it is WHO, it is today they are the second largest funders of the UN after the US. And while earlier they were willing to sort of, bide their time, hide behind the larger groups of countries, they are being far more aggressive today in international institutions. So you will see, and with the US sort of stepping away from this leadership role, I think the role of the multilateral institutions is in serious need of repair. So I think that's something which is going to be something which we are going to be looking at. Uh, the what happens in this situation, and I can come back to details during the Q&A, but I want to sort of give the bigger picture first. What happens to the India-US relationship given these trends and given where we were? I think more or less once life starts again, we will the Indo-US relationship boat will find its even keel pretty soon, because I think because the strategic logic of both of the relationship is very obvious to both countries. The democratic commonality, the possibility of economic cooperation, the possibility of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, the existing defense comfort and the agreements and basic work that has already been done, the mutual exercises and all that, the possibilities of pharmaceutical cooperation, which is which is becoming increasingly important for the world, the possibility of cooperations in vaccine development, science and technology, space exploration. I think these are the areas on which India has a natural advantage vis-a-vis other countries, and in which the US and India relationship has already reached levels of comfort. What may go slow in the short while at least is perhaps defense cooperation, purchases, because of budgetary reasons. I think countries are going to be looking at reallocating their budgets more towards health, more towards domestic infrastructure. That's going to be the political call. And that's, I think, it's necessary. So I think some of that may begin to go slow, which was being done. What may happen is that we were buying oil to offset the trade balance, but oil prices have fallen dramatically. So I think the impact of our purchases of oil on the trade balance is going to be less and less. The civil aviation industry has been very badly hit by the pandemic. And we were buying, I think there were 300 Boeings in the pipeline from the United States, which would make a major dent in the trade balance. But I think civil aviation is going to go on a hold. So I think this purchases will also probably slow down in terms of civil aviation. So I think in terms of trade, we will have to find more creative ways of making sure that trade doesn't become a major problem. We should hurry up and rush and get the deals that we can. And they were pretty advanced when President Trump came here, so they shouldn't be all that difficult because these aspects may slow down. I think a lot of possibilities of cooperation lie in the Indo-Pacific because, and I'm not saying only in military terms, in terms of creation of infrastructure, in terms of creation of connectivity projects, in terms of human resource development. This is all that we are working a lot in terms of cooperating with the American Blue Dot network, with creating domain awareness for various countries in that area. As Chinese aggression increases, our challenge, of course, will be how do we do this without making it sound anti-Chinese? Now, that's the fine line. And that's the narrow space that Indian diplomacy works in. So because we have China as a neighbor, we have China as an aggressive neighbor today. So there are limits to which we can be seen to be hobnobbing with the United States on something which the Chinese perceive as anti-Chinese. So we have to project ourselves, as the foreign minister said, we are a leading power which plays by the rules. So somewhere we have to walk that fine line, and that's the challenge we will face. I think the growth areas will be pharmaceuticals, health, in investment in telecom. For instance, you've seen the massive investments by Facebook in Geo. And a new area which is coming back is textiles. Not just textile export from India, but cooperation and investment in textile industry in the United States. I think that is another area which has a potential for growth. The one more aspect, and I'll probably wind up, is one aspect which has suffered a lot because of the pandemic is the people to people relations. We have a large number of professionals, and immigration was not always a comfortable place during President Trump's tenure. But so far, there had been a tightening up of the H-1B process, but not a winding back. So to many, because H-1B professionals are also very useful to American companies. In fact, the vast majority of H-1B professionals work for American giants like Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon, and not for Indian IT. So I think that is one thing which we have to see whether this can be kept on an even keel. The second thing is students. You have 200,000 students of Indian origin from India in the United States. They're the second largest group of students after the Chinese. Now, what is going to happen to them? Are they just going to lose a year? Are American universities going to change over to virtual teaching for a year? What's going to happen next year? I think there's a mutual interest here, both for students as well as for the universities, to keep this going and find creative ways. And ultimately, I think that's also important for the larger relationship, because I don't think, you see, we are not allies, India and the US. We are strategic partners. We are not treaty allies. We are not NATO or non-NATO allies either. So we have a sui generis kind of status with the United States. And a lot of it is based on sentiment. A lot of it is based on people studying there. A lot of people having family there. A lot of, more than one congressman has told me, yes, I love India, my doctor's Indian. So these are the elements which are particularly good for the India-US relationship. And these are some things which we have to build on. I rambled a bit, I'm sorry, but I wanted to give you as big a picture as I could, and I'd be happy to go into specific directions as we get questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You have given us a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, a lot to digest. I thought I would just ask a question to set the ball rolling. In fact, two questions. One is, you spoke about how India and the US are strategic partners, not allies. And in the context of the possible Cold War that might unfold post-COVID between the US and China, do you think that there is any possibility of our formalizing this strategic alliance with the US? And would that be to our advantage? Because in the prior Cold War with the Soviet Union, I think India was more or less on the Russian side, the Soviet side, and yet we maintained our distance. Obviously, we had the non-aligned, policy. Now we have another version of non-alignment like multilateralism and so forth. So the first question is, do you think that it would be useful to enter into not just a partnership such as we have with the US along all the lines that you've pointed out, pharmaceutical, technology, students, information exchange, manufacturing, and so forth. But is it also a good idea to actually formalize this sort of alliance without riling the Chinese too much? The second question, I think you're uniquely suited to address, which is there a role for our growing strategic relationship with Israel in this whole configuration. In other words, uh, Israel US have a amazing relationship because the Jewish Americans are a very powerful and very organized group. So if you take the New York Times, they might be very anti-Trump, very liberal, but when it comes to Israel, there is no compromise. Whoever the president is, they're going to make sure that Israel's interests are not harmed. Is it possible for the Indian diaspora in the US also to assume a strategic relationship within the United States, like the Jewish Americans? There's certainly Indian Americans are certainly very affluent today, and as you said, they are doctors, engineers, techies, and they are on both sides of the political spectrum. When I was studying them, most Indian Americans used to be Democrats, and now I see a lot of them are also Republicans. So, in other words, can we model our diasporic interventions in the US on Israel on the one hand, and on the other hand, this triangulation with Israel as one point in this triangle, the US is another, and India the third one. Is there a way to leverage this in this post-COVID world order? Thank you.
Thank you. I think those are absolutely excellent questions, Makran. On the first one, I think it's easier to answer. I don't think India, by nature, by history, uh, and by politics, will ever consider a formal alliance. Uh, even in the even when we had a treaty with the Soviet Union, uh, we had a treaty, but for peace and friendship. But we would strongly resist being called an ally of the Soviet Union. And, we kept till the last, we kept saying we are non aligned. And so I think even if we run into a Cold War II, uh, which frankly I don't think the world is at the similar place like United States, USSR days. This is a far more integrated world. It's US and China are rivals, but not in the same way. So I don't think we will what we will run into is probably not a Cold War 2.0, but more an era of great power rivalry. So where you see US, China, a rising Russia, uh, perhaps a group of middle powers as they are being called. You have Japan, South Korea, perhaps India. Uh, uh, so more of a great power rivalry role. Now, in this, even if we have this world, I think in India probably it might accelerate our, ironing out whatever differences we still have with the US, signing up the other foundational agreements so we have a good basis for technology cooperation, exchange, maritime cooperation, clear out the trade deck so that we are not fighting with each other on trade issues. So it'll be probably an effort to get more of an alignment rather than to get a formal alliance. On the second issue, you're absolutely right. The Israel, US, India relationship is something which is of great value in both these relationships, and they play ever since we have managed to get a good relationship going with Israel. We are now definitely that plays into a comfortable place in the United States because they realize that India Israel has a good relationship. So this helps a lot in different places in the US. For instance, in the US Congress, a lot of congressmen, whether they may be Jewish or not, certainly have a very soft corner for Israel. And that helps us with India US issues. Similarly, in Israel, having a comfortable that the Indo US relationship is good really impacts on in Israel in very positive terms. It gives them a comfort level in terms of technology cooperation because otherwise they would be going against the grain if they couldn't cooperate with us, if we didn't have a good relationship going. The triangulation happens all the time, both in conversations plus in certain formal ways. We have, we are always invited to attend the APAC annual conferences and speak there. The ambassadors, I've spoken there more than once. The Jewish organizations in the United States are very active. They stay in touch with the embassy. They like to meet our visiting ministers and so on and so forth. So this triangulation is a fact of life already, and it's very useful.
Thank you. Very good. Now I'll throw it open. You can message me, and so I'll call on you. And in the meanwhile, if someone has a question, just raise your hand, and I'll call you out. And then you unmute your mic, please, and speak. Professor Raju, always the first on the draw. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for your extensive big picture as you've drawn. Now let's get into a bit of the details. The US is in an economic crisis. As you said, it's like the Great Depression. Now, given that, how is it going to impact the relations? See, are our techies going to get jobs there? Or is there going to be very intense rivalry? That is one sort of thing. The other sort of thing is, will the Cold War 2.0, it is there, whether you call it that or not, will it result in the disintegration of the United States?
Well, I think the first part of your question, Professor, I did hint at during my talk. I think the economic crisis is going to be deep in the US. The unemployment is high. The resistance against foreigners coming and work in the US is going to be high. So I think in the short run, our techies will get jobs depending on what they are going for. They will need to be, if there are areas in which the US is interested in getting good professionals from outside and working on them, and we happen to match that, I think the US companies will make sure that they get there. But I think the days of our, everybody just with a basic degree going there and making money on computers is for a while, both economically and I think very important socially, going to become more and more difficult. There's going to be, given the stage, the way the US is in at the moment, not just economically, but socially, I think there is going to be a resistance to foreigners, particularly in inner America. So I think I would say hold our horses and people will have to have specialized knowledge and specialized qualifications for being wanted by the US companies. On this, and the second question, you said it was about the Cold War. Sorry, and the specific question was?
Is this Cold War 2.0 going to result in the disintegration of the United States, given the social tension that you already mentioned?
Well, I don't think the Cold War is going to result in the disintegration of the United States. I think what the United States, for instance, is in a crisis of leadership. And I think, but the United States systems are tremendously strong.